Iowa. The sophomore album, technically the junior album, considering their first was self-released, but Slipknot had a lot to prove. After the success of 1999's self-titled debut, one that went on to sell 2 million copies and essentially take the world by storm and kind of shock the system a little bit, at least here in America, Slipknot had a lot to prove. They had to prove that they were not a one-trick pony, and really now, in 2001, everybody saw them coming. Everybody knew that they were, a band that existed. They had a huge fan base. They had already toured to support the first record. Now they had to encounter the mountain, the challenge of going back into the studio, recording a follow-up album, and releasing it to the public. What they got was Iowa. Iowa was the second major release. And Iowa actually satisfied those expectations, and in fact, for many people, probably exceeded them. In terms of composition, Iowa can at times feel like almost a contextual continuation of the self-titled album, but whenever you listen to the two of them back to back, you begin to recognize that Iowa is actually the superior disc, and the darkness that you heard on the self-titled release by Slipknot is magnified on this album. It's magnified in a couple of different ways. It's magnified also based around the fact that there's a lot of reality that centers this album whenever it comes to the darkness. The band themselves actually stated that based around recording this follow-up album and kind of following up in the success that they had with their self-titled debut, that there was actually some relationships that were strained. There were actually a lot of moments where the band themselves found themselves in turmoil. It was a very dark time. It was a time of great self-discovery. It was a time where they kind of had to bond together, and by doing so, they strained a lot of relationships with one another, which would eventually lead for them to kind of call it quits for a while, to go on hiatus and kind of focus on their outside projects after this album's release. But we're not here to talk about that. Contextually, Iowa also comes across as a little bit more of a diverse album. It's one where, at the end of the self-titled album review that we just did, it was said that Slipknot needed to prove that they were able to improve as songwriters. They had to really showcase growth, development, evolution, maturation. They had to show that they had the ability to take this idea that they had started, to take this notion, this moment in time, and build upon it. And they did so. Iowa feels more consistent. Whenever Iowa has its finger, its pulse on the accelerator, it certainly is one that is able to maintain its quickness, its ferocity, its raw fury. It's something where that element of the self-titled disc has not decayed whatsoever. In fact, it's something that feels magnified by a little bit more frustration. It's one that seems to be magnified by a little bit of internal angst, of turmoil, anger. It feels more legit. Whereas the first album just felt like it was trying to really levy and channel as much extremity as it could, where it was trying to kind of manufacture it a little bit. This album feels like it has a bit of a legitimacy to it. Songs such as People Equals Shit seem to illuminate that factor through song title alone, but in reality, whenever you dig deep into the lyricism of this record, there is a lot of pure conveyed emotion, of pure conveyed anger, of pure conveyed rage. And it's something that can really be illuminated by 2001 in general. Whenever you consider the things that happened during this year and what was to come after this album's release, there were a lot of questions. There was a lot of questions within the country, but more often than not, we had just survived Columbine, and of course there's been a lot of targets on a lot of people's backs. The whole idea of people equals shit definitely was built upon the notion of its truth. Built upon the notion of the fact that many people are exactly that. But the songwriting chops didn't just end there. This is one that feels like it has a little bit more balance, a little bit more creativity that is kind of sheltered within the musical repertoire here. It's one that definitely feels like it has a little bit more density to it. It has more to offer than the self-titled debut. Where the self-titled debut went right was the fact that, holy shit, what the fuck just happened? It was like a runaway truck just hit you, and you liked the experience. With the second album, you see the truck coming this time, so now the truck has to get creative. Now it has to start swerving a little bit. It has to tease you. It has to, maybe hit you, like, clip you on your hip, and then decide to back up and back over you with its tires, which you kind of expected, so you're like, I expected that, and then all of a sudden the truck just decides, well, fuck that, I don't need my rear axle. They detach the rear axle. It, for some strange reason, now is made of rubber and bounces a couple of times, and then right as it's about to fall right on top of you, the rubber just flies off, and you realize, fuck, that's iron, that's steel, and it falls right on you. That's the creativity that I mean. This is an album that boasts that. It's an album that shows that. Maybe not as often as maybe I would like. Maybe not as often as many people would have liked. It's something where it feels like a couple of left turns occur from the raw ferocity that this album is able to construe. It's something where the core idea that Slipknot was able to present on the self-titled record still is present, but there is a couple of moments where they decide to kind of jump outside of it. We once again hear those clean vocals, that very Fear Factory sounding vocals early on this disc that we mentioned on the self-titled record, and there's just a couple of moments of more of a throwback to just things getting a little weird, things getting a little bit back to that whole serial killer idea, where you're in that dark, dimly lit basement with the walls splattered with the blood of those that have come before you, and just kind of that dim, dank, depraved atmosphere where you're kind of really unsure of what your fate is going to be, what's about to befall you. The last track on this album, Iowa, literally crawls along, and it's something that's a very nice change of pace. Whenever I see the elongated song lengths for these end tracks, I always kind of get excited, because I always think that this is where a band gets to kind of do something completely off-kilter and out of the ordinary if they so choose. And they certainly did with Iowa. This is one that definitely sticks out like a sore thumb comparative to the remainder of the album. And it's a nice change. It's a great change. It's one that actually shows that with a little bit of pacing, Slipknot actually could be a really kind of creepy industrial doom band. It's kind of strange. In a strange sense of minimalism, they easily could craft an atmosphere that would have all of that dank and kind of depraved feel to it, and really satisfy that craving very well. This has been hailed by some people as the masterpiece of nu metal. This has gotten that reputation. It's been hailed as a literal masterpiece of a subgenre that this band doesn't fully claim themselves to be a part of. I mean, that really shows you just how big of a tag or a label that nu metal really was at the time. There are bands that kind of wanted to distance themselves from that idea, to purvey more of an extreme sense, or to purvey more of just a traditional rock sense. But it was inescapable. Even to this day, that's a tag that still maintains itself. While I do find this to be a better effort than their self-titled debut, I also find Iowa to have some flaws to it. Iowa, by no stretch of the imagination, is a perfect album. It's one that still, at times, feels very comfortable within itself. And you would think that'd be a good thing, but whenever you see the places where they explore, whenever you see the moments where they explore, you suddenly wish that it would have happened more often. You almost would have wished that there had been 10 tracks on this 66-minute long album that would have really had some varied personality to it. Also, I gotta say that the Heretic Anthem is on this album, and it introduced the whole entire culture to that line, if you're 555, then I'm 666. It's a song I've just never gotten behind. I understand the idea, I understand the concept, yeah, it's got a nice little thrash factor to it, but meh. It's one of those songs where it does feel a bit forced, almost like it's left over from the self-titled record, where it's being self-manufactured as opposed to, well, really generated. Aside from that, really this album has a great amount of legitimacy to it. It has a great amount of personality to it. This is the reason why, after 4 years, it's best for me to go through this. You go through these albums, to review them, to talk about them, and to talk about them with a level head. It isn't the fact that Slipknot is shit because they They don't play the thrash metal that we remember from the 80s or that's being experienced in this revival. It's not the fact that people are calling them death metal when in reality they kind of aren't. They have a little bit more of an expansive nature to them. It's just something that's a little sliver of the overall puzzle. You have to look at it through fair eyes because of their importance to music history. Something we have to accept. I mentioned this in the last video. I might just mention it with all of them, just so you guys understand. After 4 years, that's something that's become prevalently, not prevalent, but apparently obvious to me. Obvious enough for me to actually talk about these guys with a heightened level of respect. Not to mention with a fairness that is kind of unfamiliar ground. This is a disc that's aged pretty well. I'm not going to lie. It's one that feels still pretty fresh. It's one where you can see how music has kind of evolved ever since Slipknot, but you also begin to realize that any band that has really tried to replicate this sound has never sounded as good. Any band that's tried to do what they've done just kind of falls flat. They're kind of a band that's the master of their league, master of their craft. It's just a craft that's not for everyone. I mean, if I were to rate the first two albums, self-titled would probably get about 6.5 to a 7. This would probably get a 7.5 to maybe an 8. And that's being kind. It's being generous. This isn't stuff that has a high replayability from me. Individual tracks, maybe, yeah. But as a whole, it still isn't for me. But I'm still giving it a shot. I'm still giving you a reason why I feel the way that I feel. While also attempting to be as fair, balanced, and really, in this case, professional as possible. I know it's weird. But now they're 2 albums in. And now the first hiatus occurred. A couple years later, that hiatus would end. And much like we're about to experience here in 2014, 10 years ago we experienced it, and a new album would surface. The Junior album. So after all of this evolution, what would they have to offer for album number 3? Let's take a look and find out.